So if you've heard of me because of copyright, because of the battles that have been going on for the last decade to reform the way copyright regulates culture and the access we have to information. But as Greg mentioned, I've recently moved on from copyright to consider issues of corruption. And many people ask me why. And I've given lots of complicated, involved explanations, but I think as obvious to you, the real reason is just the font. This is beautiful. This is paint cans font. And the thing is, you can't use a font like this to talk about copyright. Indeed, it doesn't even have a copyright symbol except for this boring sort of Geneva version. So it was the opportunity to express myself artistically that led me away from the copyright debate into this particular debate about corruption. But by corruption, I don't really care to think about quid pro quo bribes of members of parliament or Congress or institutions. What I want to think about when I think about corruption is the relationship between trust and independence. And what I want to do this morning is to show you something I think you already recognize. Extraordinary importance in our culture of the institution that many of you represent, the library, in helping us to think about these ideas of trust and independence. So let me see if I can convince you of that. So we start with this idea of trust. And the question I want you to start with here is, how is trust built? Or how is trust eroded? Think of some examples. In the marketplace, for example, there's a fantastic guidebook I'm sure many of you are familiar with, Lonely Planet. It sets itself up as being a reliable source for information about the different places it reviews. How exactly does it go about sustaining its reliability? Well, here's its pledge. Lonely Planet books provide independent advice. Lonely Planet do not accept advertising in guidebooks, nor do we accept payment in exchange for listing or endorsing any place or business. Lonely Planet writers do not accept discounts or payments in exchange for positive coverage of any sort. Now, the point is not that in this case money would necessarily mean that what they said was false, but money here leads people, or would lead people, to mistrust what they said, to wonder whether what they said was about the money rather than the truth of what they believed. Or think about this example, Wikipedia. Wikipedia, of course, doesn't accept ads. Because it's the 9th largest website in the world, that means they leave about $100 million on the table every year. Now, as someone who believes that the way they would spend that money would be good, this troubles me. So I've asked them why exactly they don't accept ads, because if they did, we could do a lot of good with $100 million a year. Jimmy Wales, the founder of Wikipedia, explained it to me like this. He said, "We do care how the general public looks to Wikipedia and all of its glories and all of its flaws, which are numerous, of course. But the one thing they don't say is, well, I don't trust Wikipedia because it's all basically advertising fluff." Again, the point is not that money here would mean what it said was false, but if this was part of the dynamic, people would wonder, is what they're saying there because of the advertising or because it's true? The problem here is not, quote, money. The problem is money in the wrong places. Here, in this way, money weakens these brands. Or think about courts. In the United States, we've been pretty good in the federal system in creating a system people trust, at least with respect to whether money influences the decisions. One way that we do this is through recusal procedures, where judges have to step aside whenever their impartiality might reasonably be questioned, including, and most importantly, when anybody in their family has a financial interest in the results. That's the direct way that the courts build trust. But there's an interestingly indirect way, too, that came to the fore in a Supreme Court decision issued just this year, Exxon Shipping versus Baker. This was a case that addressed the question of punitive damages in admiralty actions, meaning cases that would be arising in the context of the seas. The court limited punitive damages, but in an important footnote, the court said, the court is aware of a body of literature running parallel to anecdotal reports, examining the predictability of punitive awards by conducting numerous, quote, mock juries where different jurors are confronted with the same hypothetical case. But then it went on to say, because this research was funded in part by Exxon, we decline to rely on it. Funded in part by Exxon means they excluded even considering what the research had to say. Now, why? This was important and substantial research. I know this literature well. I also know the people who wrote it, and there is zero chance they had been compromised by the money that came in to support their research. And more fundamentally, you could say the Supreme Court is relying on briefs that were funded by Exxon, relying on oral arguments in the court that was funded by Exxon, so why not rely on the research that was funded in part by Exxon? And I think the reason is the court has a certain fear that they encourage a world where the researchers have a kind of improper dependency on this kind of funding for their research. And to avoid that dependency, they take a whole class of speech and they just disqualify it. They just say it won't be considered. Whether trustworthy or not is not the issue. It's just off the table as far as the Supreme Court's concerned. Now, you might look at this and think this is admirable, and I indeed do. But when you think about this in the context of what the American government does in other contexts, you might think it's actually a little bit precious. Because compare, for example, the way the government deals with the same sort of issues in other fundamental areas of important public interest. For example, public health. In the United States, environmental lead has been a target of regulation recently. In 1972, for the first time, the Environmental Protection Agency gave notice that they were going to require lead to be removed from gasoline. That began in 1976. In 1995, it was finally finished. There was no more lead sold in gasoline. Now, some people wonder, why didn't this happen sooner? Because the dangers of lead were no secret to serious scientists. Indeed, in 1921, the president of the National Lead Company issued a report reporting how lead was a dangerous chemical to be in the environment, would cause serious harm if it were spread in the environment. Nonetheless, shortly thereafter, gasoline manufacturers started adding lead to their gasoline to improve the efficacy of the gasoline in the car. And then started a campaign of misinformation about lead. In 1965, the American Petroleum Institute said, all accepted medical evidence proves conclusively that lead in the environment presents no threat to public health. 1965. 1984, it's no different. Lead Industries Association, quote, lead has been used in gasoline for 60 years and there is no evidence that anyone has ever been harmed. Now, we know those statements are not true. But this research, which led to these statements being accepted by regulators, was research funded in part by the interests directly affected by the regulation. Now, when those interests were finally overcome in 1995, when lead was banned, it had a profound influence on the safety and health of our environment in children. Since 1995, there has been an 80% drop in lead in the blood of young children because of this change, and a substantial increase in the IQ of our children because of this change in the availability of lead in the environment. But this delay was caused by studies funded in part by the interested industry. We'll take another example, chromium-6, which is a chemical used in chromium plating. There's something called the dime story that used to be told to new workers at chromium plating facilities. The old workers, when a new worker would come in, would take a dime, stick it in one side of his nose, and pull it out of the other side of his nose, because his nose had been so damaged by the chromium plating process that there was a hole between both sides. So obviously, or one would think, obviously, there's an issue here about the safety of these chemicals. And OSHA, our Occupational Safety and Health Administration, in 1976 says they've concluded that comprehensive occupational health standard is urgently needed emphasis in the original, to protect employees, and that it would complete it in the shortest possible time. That was 1976. The regulations were completed in 2006. And the delay in those regulations came from an extraordinary list of studies funded in part by the industry regulated. Now, in both of these cases, we have regulatory proceedings, which obviously have to be driven by data, but where does the data come from? In lead, the data came from industries, studies that were funded in part by the industries regulated, chromium funded in part by the industries regulated, leading to decades of delay in these and many other contexts of public health, leading to literally thousands of lives lost. Because data presented by industries that were interested was funded in part by those industries. Not just here. Think about pharmaceutical companies in the United States. In 2005, we spent about $200 billion on prescription drugs. That's 5 times the amount spent in 1990. Of that $200 billion, about $15.7 billion was spent on promoting prescription drugs by the drug companies. Right? This year, we'll have a presidential election that breaks the $1 billion mark. They spend 15 times that every year promoting prescription drugs. Now, in the process of promoting these drugs, they spend money on something called detailing, $5 billion on detailing. Detailing is the process where they send representatives out to doctors to try to get the doctors to use their prescription drugs over other drugs, including especially generic drugs. The number of detailers has increased dramatically. Between 1995 and 2005, it's gone from 38,000 to 100,000 detailers. That's 2.5 doctors for every detailer in the United States. Now, they do this detailing by handing out samples and gifts for their drugs, samples of their drugs, little gifts to get people to remember the drug. And they intend by this to affect the prescribing choices of the doctors by making the doctors prescribe their drugs over something else. As one detailer described it, the essence of pharmaceutical gifting is, quote, bribes that aren't considered bribes. While it's the doctor's job to treat patients and not to justify their actions, it's my job to constantly sway the doctors. It's a job, and I'm paid and trained to do it. Doctors are neither trained nor paid to negotiate. Most of the time, they don't even realize that's what they are doing. Now, this is actually small potatoes in the problem I'm describing. See, there are small potatoes. The more fundamental issue I want you to think about is research in basic science. And here the work of Professor Drummond-Rennie is extraordinarily important. Drummond-Rennie became the editor at one of the most important scientific journals in the United States. And he published this article, When Evidence Isn't. And in this article he says, I became a medical editor just at the time when instances of scientific fraud were hitting the newspapers. These were cases of fabricated work, the bad guys. And he describes how the good guys got him. They got rid of this fabricated work. But then he says, after a year or so, as an editor, it became obvious to me that such rare cases, the chainsaw massacres of science, were not the main problem. We are now discovering a vastly more important problem, the massive bias and distortion of the published evidence by researchers and their sponsors, both influenced by money. When scientists had a great deal at stake, some were prepared in the name of prestige to take shortcuts, falsify, fabricate, plagiarize, bamboozle, lie, cheat, and throw away their reputations simply to notch up more publications, advance their careers, and, of course, make more money. They would attest to a complete absence of financial conflicts of interest, but at the same time failed to tell us of relevant patents that they held or that they had appeared as paid expert witnesses on the subject on dozens of occasions. And it became apparent that many trials, though ostensibly coming from impartial and prestigious research universities, were actually set up, designed, conducted, and the data analyzed by the companies themselves. It was found that the companies were paying physician scientists to publish the same results of the same trials in different journals under different authors' names with no cross-referencing. They were getting the results their sponsors wanted in drug trials by hobbling the other horse in the race, the competitor's drug, which in the trials was administered in the wrong dosage by the wrong route. And they were offering tens of thousands of dollars simply to add their own names to reviews of a drug's efficacy, reviews they had never seen before and which were always favorable to the new drug. What's the result of all of this? False science, as Professor Remy puts it, in every one of the many scores of such studies, of published trials. An overwhelming bias was found in favor of the sponsor's drug, a bias that was not present when the trials were performed by investigators free of commercial funding. These were wrong results, produced by an improper dependency created by the fact that the work was funded in part by the interests that were being judged. Or think about this case. Here's a drug called Alteplase, or Activase is the brand name. You might be a little confused by the slogan, choose to reperfuse. You might think, oh boy, I must be stupid, reperfuse? But actually, it's the Oxford English Dictionary that's stupid, apparently. There's no such word as reperfuse. There is a word reperfusion, so I'm not quite sure what the verb form is intended to mean. But anyway, if you're going to reperfuse, you should choose to reperfuse with Activase. Okay. Now, Activase is a drug that deals with what we would have called strokes, but what the industry wants to call brain attacks, much more dramatic now. And in 1998, a study by the American Heart Association tried to evaluate whether this drug was safe and effective. The conclusion was the drug was safe and effective, substantial support, though the report initially had a dissent attached to it. But when the AHA published the report, they erased the dissent. Indeed, they removed the name of the doctor who had filed the dissent from the report of the committee that had performed the study. And then an enterprising journalist discovered that Genentech, the company that had sponsored the drug, had given the AHA $11 million, as this journalist put it for the British Medical Journal, raising obvious questions. This recommendation may have been made in the true spirit of unbiased scientific inquiry, she wrote, but the appearance of dispassionate analysis was eroded by large donations from a drug company. Because the study was funded in part by the interests affected, we don't trust the results. One final example here. Think about the problem of vaccines. And I want to be very careful, so let me state very clearly, vaccines are good and right and needed, and I am not saying mercury causes autism. Okay? Let's make this perfectly clear. Vaccines are good, and mercury does not cause autism. Right? Put that aside. What I want you to think about, though, is parents who have children with autism. And I want you to think about the years of extraordinary anxiety they've suffered as they try to understand the relationship between what they did and the consequences that it had on their children. And recognize that these questions are leading to an extraordinary drop-off in the number of parents who actually vaccinate their children. Before 1991, less than 1% of parents refused to vaccinate. In America, the number is now over 2.5%. Now, why is it parents are refusing to vaccinate? Well, as the U.S. House Oversight Committee put it, it's because of this pervasive lack of trust in the industry when the industry says these vaccines are safe. And why is that? As the House Oversight Committee put it, because of the perceived conflicts that exist between those who are judging the drugs and those who are producing the drugs. As the committee put it, the FDA standards, the Food and Drug Administration standards, defining conflicts of interest are ridiculously broad. The CDC, the Center for Disease Control, has virtually no standards because all committee members automatically receive annual waivers. What that means is they sit on a committee that evaluates a drug by company X, and they receive an automatic waiver of a conflict of interest for money received from company X. In one case, as the study pointed out, a doctor had received $250,000 from a drug company whose drugs he was evaluating. Now, this fact leads to the following kind of press being spread out in this space.
But the science is
This
clear.
is Robert Kennedy Jr.
I read the science at first, and there's literally hundreds and hundreds of studies that connect thimerosal to these disastrous neurological disorders. Then I talked to the scientists, then I went and I talked to the federal bureaucrats who are defending thimerosal, and I said, what are you relying on? And I looked at the science they're relying on, and I can tell you, Joe, it is so weak. And you and I have seen, legal practice when junk science, and we know, what these phony scientists are who create
It
this
happened
stuff.
in big tobacco.
Right,
It
tobacco.
happens in
And
big
this is-
oil.
and this
It's
is-
happening in global warming. And now it's happening in a way that's impacting our kids' lives.
This is classic tobacco science. It is junk.
Classic tobacco science. The point is, I think Robert Kennedy's wrong. I don't think there's a connection between thimerosal and autism. I don't think the science supports such a claim. But he can plug directly into a meme that is recognizable by all of us. Classic tobacco science. And as you think about that meme being spread, is there any wonder that parents behave the way they do? A system that can't figure out that lead or chromium-6 is dangerous. A system that can't understand why Genentech giving a company evaluating their product $10 million is a problem, or committee members getting $250,000 from a drug company who they're evaluating. That type of system breeds mistrust. And is there any wonder in light of that mistrust that parents express that mistrust by backing out of the public health system in a way that is profoundly destructive to public health? Or think about politics in America. I don't know if any of you saw this fantastic film called Maxed Out. It's the story of credit card debt in the United States that has many dimensions to this problem. But one reason there's an extraordinary problem with credit card debt is a statute called the Bankruptcy Abuse Prevention and Consumer Protection Act of 2005. Actually, it's a little bit of a typo. There's no consumer protection in this act at all. The effect of this statute is to make it effectively impossible for lower-income Americans to discharge their credit card debts. So Bethlehem Steel can use bankruptcy to escape pension obligations. Enron can use bankruptcy to escape obligations to deliver power to the state of California. But you can't escape credit card obligations in the United States. You will literally carry these obligations in the sense of being responsible for them in one form forever. Now, this proposal to change the bankruptcy laws to have this effect with respect to credit cards first was proposed in the administration of President Clinton, and he was originally in favor of it. But then an op-ed was published in the New York Times, which Hillary Clinton read, and she decided that this was an awful bill. That's a small b here, just to be clear. And she is credited with single-handedly keeping this bill from becoming law, to her great credit. But like Jason in Friday the 13th, this bill would not go away. So in 2001, it returned. And by now, First Lady Clinton had become Senator Clinton. And by now, she had received $140,000 from the financial services companies affected by this bill. So what did she do? She flipped. She voted for that awful bill twice. Now, why did she do this? Well, she says, of course, it's not the money. Here she is at a conference of bloggers in Chicago in 2007.
I don't think, based on my 35 years of fighting for what I believe in, anybody seriously believes I'm going to be influenced by a lobbyist or a particular interest group.
Now, the bloggers didn't believe her, but I fundamentally believe her. You don't get to be Hillary Clinton by being pushed around by money coming into your campaign. That's not who she is. But the point to recognize that is so rarely understood in this debate is, how do other people perceive something like this? What do they hear in the explanation for why someone does something after they hear they received $140,000? Is it possible to even have a discussion about the matter once this money is on the table? Now, the point here is to recognize how money poisons trust. Money, in some places, poisons the possibility of trust. As people begin to believe that decisions or actions or will have been guided by something it should not have been, a dependence, an improper dependence on that money. The point is not, though, that money is bad in every context, right? Obviously, money is not always bad here. Money is often quite good as a system for setting up incentives in the right places. It is essential that money be the thing that direct how we do our work. Your pension investments, you hope, are being guided by someone who's worrying about the money, about making the most money possible. That's exactly the incentives we want. You want Dell Corporation to worry about how to make the most money possible so they produce fantastic new products that you can buy and use in your libraries. You want the market to be driven by money in all sorts of ways, and that's a good thing too, because there's enormous wealth created by that system of money-directed markets. Money-driven markets produce wealth, and wealth is good. So I am not saying there's a problem with money everywhere. I'm only saying we begin to recognize where it is a problem and think about how we respond to that. So, I said we should think about trust, and now I want you to see trust as a problem of independence. Trust depends upon this independence. Now, independence is a classically American idea. Our framers thought a lot about independence. But I don't mean the independence of 1776, when we liberated ourselves from the oppressive Brits. I mean the independence of circa 1785, 4 years before the Constitution of the United States was enacted, when most sensible people thought America was a failure. And they thought it was a failure because of an extraordinary corruption that had spread throughout the society, a corruption, as they spoke of it, caused by a lack of independence in the representatives who were in our state legislatures. They were dependent. They were dependent on interests they shouldn't be dependent upon. As Jefferson put it, this dependence begets subservience and venality. It suffocates the germ of virtue and prepares fit tools for the designs of ambition. This is what government had become. And he's put it ominously, we should look forward to a time, and that's not a distant one, when corruption in this, as in the country from which we derive our origin, will have seized the heads of government and be spread by them through the body of the people, when they will purchase the voices of the people and make them, the people, pay the price. So our framers sought non-dependent, independent representatives who would pursue the right answer for the right reason. And their common aim was to build institutions, constitutions, against that improper dependence, where improper is defined based on the institution. So, for democratic institutions like Congress or the presidency, proper dependence is dependence upon the people. Improper dependence is dependence upon anything else. For legal institutions like the courts, proper dependence is dependence upon the law. Improper dependence is dependence upon anything else. Now, it's hard for Americans to utter these words, so I'll stumble a little bit here, but they failed. They failed. At least with respect to this institution, they failed. The 19th century American Congress was a cesspool of corruption. Daniel Webster, one of the foremost of our framing generations, was a member of Congress at the time. He was also employed by the Bank of the United States, regulated by Congress. He wrote a letter to the bank. If it be wished that my relation to the bank be continued, it may be well to send me the usual retainer. Bribery was not even a crime in Congress until 1853. The 19th century is filled with these examples of congressmen using their power to feather their nest. And you might think the 20th century is similar. Cases like the recent conviction of Senator Ted Stevens of ethics violations, or Congressman Randy Dew Cunningham, who produced this extraordinary list of the relationship between how much government contracts he will get for what price. So that says $16 million contract if you give him a boat worth $140,000, a $70 million contract if you give him $50,000, an $18 million contract for $50,000. He had it all worked out, and he wrote it out very kindly on congressional stationery that he handed out to the people who he was soliciting bribes from. So you might look at these cases and think, well, this is just more of the same from what we had in the 19th century, but I think that's wrong. I believe, as Dennis Thompson of Harvard puts it, that observers believe that the legislator's integrity is greater today than in any time in the past. That's right. The vast majority of these members are not there to try and find ways to feather their nest. The problem is a different kind of dependency. It's a dependency on money, but not money for their own personal gain, money to secure tenure, and not tenure at a fantastic place like this, tenure in Congress. This constant attention to money for the purpose of securing the re-election of them or their party. And this is the one thing our Congress has actually been pretty good at. If you look at historical re-election rates, they're almost perfect now. If you're a member who wants to be re-elected, there's about a 97% chance you will be re-elected. They spend between 30 and 70% of their time raising money to be re-elected. They develop a sixth sense, constantly judging how their actions will affect not the voters in the district, but their ability to raise money. This second job, raising money, becomes their first job, yielding them to the influence game that is Washington now, where increasingly members see that companies see that the return from favorable regulation is actually greater than the return from innovation. Makes more sense to spend money on buying lobbyists than on figuring out how to build a better mousetrap. As the chief lobbyist for the Clinton administration put it, people in industry are willing to invest money because they see opportunities here. The number of lobbyists since the Clinton administration has doubled in Washington. The costs of these lobbyists have doubled as well. Members increasingly depend upon these lobbyists to raise money, feeding this dependency. The framers failed to avoid this problem. But the thing I want you to see in their great virtue, the most important lesson they taught us, was that they recognized that it was critical to chain an institution to the right incentives. They didn't do it, but that was their aim. To build proper dependencies inside of institutions, we need to trust. And to avoid dependence that is improper inside of these institutions. So, I said trust depends on independence. And now I want you to see how lost we are in recognizing this very simple, obvious fact. To recognize how oblivious we have become to this relationship, at least in the United States, not in Congress, where it's obvious enough, but in the institutions that we surround ourselves with as we do our job. For example, in the university. As I've described, universities have medical centers. These are the locus of drug research. Massive conflicts have been noted about this drug research. As the New York Times recently put it, 2/3 of academic medical centers had financial stakes in companies that sponsored research within their facilities. In another study, 2/3 of medical school department chairs were found to receive departmental income, and 3/5 received personal income from drug companies. This is driven by this weird sense, especially among doctors, of an entitlement in the United States to be rich. Somehow the fact that you can deal with human bodies well means you're entitled to have tons of money, rendering them oblivious to the way in which it destroys the basic institution's trust. Or a second example from the university. There's something called the Bayh-Dole Act, which was passed in the Reagan administration, which allowed patents to issue to innovators who received their funding to innovate from the federal government. So you received money from the government, you did certain research, if you discovered innovation, you could patent it and then privately benefit from that patent. The thought was that this system, creating a dependency on money in the researchers, would increase their productivity. What they didn't think about was that the way that this dependence on money would change the nature of, quote, research in many fields of university research. Changing the environment from one where people were open about what they did to secret about what they did because their lawyers told them you can't talk about what you're doing or that would destroy the ability to patent your new innovation. Changing cooperative fields of research where people worked with other universities around the country into competitive ones where secrets were kept because how else can we patent if we don't keep our secret? Changing the dependency here to money arguably weakens the product of this research, and the Bayh-Dole Act was totally oblivious to this obvious consequence. Or think about the problem of archives, something at the center of what you do for a living. In my view, copyright as a system worked very well, historically, in dealing with the problem of archives of books. It provided limited protection creating an incentive, and then got out of the way after the creation was made. So there's a distinction, I think, between the publisher's life of a book and the after-publisher's life of a book. The publisher's life is where you're selling the book. The after-publisher's life is when you're just archiving the book. Copyright was central to the publisher's life, not so important to the after-publisher's life. This is because of a technical feature of the way copyright law works. Right? So think about a book. If these are all the uses of a book, an important set of these uses are technically unregulated by the law of copyright. So to read a book is not a fair use of the book. It's a free use of the book, because to read a book is not to produce a copy. To give someone a book is not a fair use of the book. It's a free use of the book, because to give someone a book is not to produce a copy. To sell a book in the United States is explicitly exempted from the law of copyright, because to sell a book is not to produce a copy. To sleep on a book is a totally unregulated act in any law anywhere in the world, because to sleep on a book is not to produce a copy. These unregulated acts surround a set of core regulated acts. Regulation necessary to create the incentive to produce great new work. To publish a book requires the permission of the copyright owner, because that monopoly is necessary to create the incentives to produce great new works. And then in the American tradition, in the Anglo-American tradition, there's a thin sliver of exceptions called fair uses. Uses which otherwise would have been regulated by the law because they involved a copy, but which the law says ought to remain free to create incentives to build upon or share or do other important works to the law of copyright. So the thing is to see how this is a balance between unregulated, regulated, and fair uses of the book. Balanced, where copyright law was triggered upon a copy in a world where copies were rare, where most uses produced no copy. Now that balance is what made libraries possible. And libraries, of course, assure the universal access to move this work in a way that made it free for other people to access. Enter the internet, a digital environment, where because of the architecture of digital technologies, every single use produces a copy. So we go from this balanced picture to this picture merely because the platform through which we get access to our culture is changed. To move a book, to make it available, triggers copyright law, triggering a requirement for permission, an expensive and clumsy system of permission that increasingly defines your life. You need to recognize, as I'm sure many of you do, that this is a radical change over our tradition. And the question we should ask is it any good? Well, here's a particular example of how it's had its effect. You all know this company. You might have heard of this project, which became the Google Book Search Project, an objective to Googleize books. Right? Well, what exactly would that mean? Well, there are three categories of books they were going to consider in this project. 18 million books in the total libraries that they were going to scan. Of those 18 million, about 9% were in copyright and in print. 16% were in the public domain, meaning 75% of these books were presumptively under copyright, but out of print. And out of print means there's nobody obvious to go to ask for permission to do anything with these books. So the Google Book Search Project said, okay, what we're going to do is go scan all 18 million books and then grant access to these books differentially, depending on their status. So there are three kinds of access. For public domain books, they would grant full access. Indeed, you could download a PDF of the book for free. Full access looks like this, page through the book however you want. For works presumptively under copyright, Google Books would give you at least snippet access. And snippet access looks like this, literally snippets. So you search on a word, you get snippets of the page. Don't worry, they didn't actually tear the pages to do this. Snippets on a page that would show you that the words exist in the book that you're looking for, but you can't read the book. You can't get around this limitations on seeing what's in that book. You're given links to used bookstores, and in a later version, even links to libraries to get the book if you wanted. And then with respect to books that were in print and in copyright, you got as much access as the publishers or authors were allowed. So here's an example of a book there where you can read a couple pages around the particular search term that you're looking for. Now, obviously, not everybody loves Google. Not everybody loves the Google Book Search Project. And in the United States, when you don't love someone, what you do is you typically sue them. So in 2005, the Authors Guild, the American Association of Publishers, did exactly that. They sued Google. Their position was that you needed permission before you scanned any of the books from the copyright owners. Well, not the 16% that were in the public domain, but the rest of the books that were presumptively under copyright. You needed permission from the copyright owner even to scan. Well, again, for the 9% in print and in copyright, that's not so hard. We can build, it's Google. They can easily contact all of these people. That's fine. But the thing to recognize is, what about the 75%? If you have to get permission before you even scan these books, what this means is, what this rule means is, what the position of the American Association of Publishers and Authors Guild is that these works are invisible in the digital age because there is no way to get permission. Now, as you know, last week there was a settlement in this case announced by Google and the plaintiffs. In the settlements, my view is there was important progress made. Google is now allowed to make 20% of that 75% available freely. They pay for this right, a per book charge, but they make 20% of it available freely. And then the user can buy full access to the book if they want, and all of the funds will then be administered in a collective rights way by the publishers and authors. Left open in this settlement, not addressed by either party, is the question of whether what Google intended to do originally is fair use, whether scanning and making snippets available is fair use. And by leaving that question open, Google did not participate in, I think, a terrible conclusion, which would have been to say that that's not fair use, because I believe what Google wanted to do originally was plainly fair use. But here's the fear. As this digital library gets developed, is it really something different from a bookstore? Do we make decisions about what's accessible depend upon the profit from making it accessible? Because if we do, you know this is a radical change in what a library is. The ethic of a library, of course, is not to have this kind of dependence driving what is made available. Copyright law here, spreading these rights, not for the purpose of incentivizing creation of new works, but to simply stake claims in existing works, has the potential to skew access, deny universal access, corrupt the basic way in which a library is intended to function. Now, the point is not against copyright. Instead, like money, it's a point against copyright in the wrong place, and a recognition of how we've become oblivious to the idea that there might actually be a wrong place for copyright because we're so convinced of the essential national security interest in the United States that it maintain its central place in every space of expression. Or think about the context of film. Copyright, again, I think was good for books. It's awful for the long-term life of film. This is Charles Guggenheim. He was a Oscar-winning, Peabody Award-winning documentary filmmaker, one of the most important documentary filmmakers of the 60s and 70s and 80s, especially for the Democratic Party. 1968, he made the extraordinary documentary celebrating the life of Robert Kennedy just a couple months after Robert Kennedy was assassinated. Interesting footnote, his son, Davis Guggenheim, produced the Obama documentary that was showed 40 years later at the Democratic National Convention this year. Davis Guggenheim is the documentary filmmaker who produced Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth. So this is an important archive of American history, the documentaries of Charles Guggenheim. Charles Guggenheim's daughter, Grace Guggenheim, has literally spent 20 years of her life clearing the rights to make these works available. Now, why does it take 20 years to clear these rights? Well, as you know, documentaries are often snippets of other people's work added together. And so, for example, it might be 60 seconds from a CBS News program. And the practice of documentary filmmaking during the 1960s and 70s was something like this. There would be a contract or license. The first point would be, all rights are governed by this contract. No fair use rights. It's this contract that governs the right. Number two, we're granting you a 5-year North American educational use permission to use our stuff, or something like that. Well, that raises the obvious question that they, of course, were never thinking about. What happens after 5 years? what can you do with the film? And the answer is, you can't distribute the film after 5 years without going back and getting permission from each of these people whose work was included in your film, which means that this film literally disappears from the archive of material we can continue to make available in the future because, again, of this improper dependence on a copyright property system in a context where we should be worrying about cultural preservation and access to our past. Every single book ever published, we will have access to. But a tiny fraction of documentary films made in the 20th century, we will have access to. The rest of them will be illegal. Once again, a system oblivious to the obvious ways in which its purpose gets corrupted. One final example, research journals. Copyright, of course, originally, in my view, was just fine for research journals. It regulated the printing. Access to a journal and research articles was physical. So we had an economy where free referees produced lots of work to produce copyrighted journals, and the costs were relatively low at the time. The alternatives to this system were basically none at the time. Enter the internet, where distribution costs get close to zero. And access could be, as we have dreamed in the library community from the beginning of libraries, universal. So, what does copyright do here? Well, it has fundamentally interfered with the opportunity to make universal access to this work because of the aggressive control of an increasingly concentrated industry. I don't want to say anything about what that aggressive control might be, but it's increasingly concentrated, leading to this defeat of the fundamental objective of libraries, universal access to knowledge. Once again, because of this improper dependence upon a system of regulation, oblivious to the way in which this system of regulation interferes with the objectives of copyright, which were to spread access to knowledge. Okay, so I've set up a picture of trust. I've said relates to independence. I've said somehow we've lost this recognition in at least my culture right now. What is this relationship to you? Well, I feel like I've spent the last decade of my life trying to get people to wake up from a stupor that they were sitting in around the issue of copyright, not recognizing how copyright law had been transformed not to be the tool of spreading knowledge, but increasingly blocking the way knowledge was spread. And not for the purpose of saying we should abolish copyright. There are abolitionists out there, and I'm not one of them, but for the purpose of saying we needed to update it to make it make sense in digital technologies. And we have made progress in that debate. Not among politicians, they're still totally clueless, at least in the United States, but many in the public. And the important fact is we have made that progress because of you. Literally, because of you. You are responsible for the success in this space because it is the credible voice, not of lawyers or law professors or Lessigs, the credible voice of librarians that has increasingly, in this debate in the United States, woken people up to why this system is so troubling. You have done an enormously important job in getting people to see that this is not just a question of whether one particular industry wins over pirates. It's a question of access to our culture. And so now, after spending many, many years speaking to library organizations around the world, pulling them into this debate around copyright, asking them to help fight this debate credibly, so now I'm back here with you, asking you to think about this issue of corruption. Long before we think about political corruption, I don't want you to worry about that at all. I want you to help think about this more basic kind of corruption, this loss of independence and trust in the most basic institutions of our society. We need you here too. We need your image because we need to remember just how improbable you, libraries, are. Right? If you didn't exist today, you wouldn't have been created. You are contrary to so much that is central to the norms of today. You are exactly opposite these norms. You provide Free access, free as in beer, in a world where meter access to everything is the norm. And you provide free access, where free means as in speech, neutral platforms of access to our knowledge, in a world where sponsored access is increasingly the norm. You built these institutions of trust because of the independence that was at the core of who you were. Maybe not always, maybe not in Georgia, but you understood why this was important. And you are the one profession that hasn't put money at the center of what you do. You have not been bought out. Too bad for you. The interests here that you represent affect the most important parts of our culture, and you can teach us through your practices these values, again, not just in the context of libraries, but everywhere in our culture. You can help us restate this strong ethic of independence that is central to free society functioning. You can fight for it. In the context of open access to knowledge, supporting movements like the Public Library of Science, resisting improper sponsorships that conflict with the ethic of independence in your work. You can support this independence, and you can help restore this trust by reminding us of how this improper dependence destroys it, especially as we increasingly live in a world where money from government is going to decline. You have enormous capital, even if you have little money. You have enormous political capital in this crucial debate. No other profession has it. So, I want you to recognize how clearly central you are in this debate. You get this, and you can teach us something from what you practice every day. Thank you very much. Thank you. That's interesting to read. Oh, great. I think we're going to first. Good. Thank you very much.
I'd like to take the opportunity to thank Professor Lessig for challenging us in our thinking, particularly in an age where a vast majority of ourselves and our children increasingly flick to Google and Wikipedia to find information, reaffirming the place of libraries and the voice that you have in challenging how all of that works. I think we have time for questions from the floor. Is that right? Yep. So I'd like to open the floor up for questions.
I'm a law professor, so I cold call on people if I don't get questions. Right over here.